Good morning. Thank you all for joining us, and we're going to have some fun this morning. I'm so thrilled to be joined by Ambassador Susan Rice and Mayor Pete Buttigieg. And I think it's clear whenever Vice President Biden talks about who he's going to pass the baton to in the future generation, these are two of the leaders he's talking about. So I want to start with you, Susan. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the news, as we all know. President Trump doesn't leave us bored for too long. But yesterday we learned that Donald Trump had acknowledged during taped interviews back in January with Bob Woodward that he knew about the threat of coronavirus and that he was purposefully downplaying the impact. So I summarize that. Obviously, I think most people, unless they're living under a rock, have seen this. But so I want to ask you first, and take this anywhere you want to go, but how do partners and allies around the world see that and hear that? Are they numb to it, or how does it sit with them, and how will it impact their perception of the United States?
Well, Jen, before we get to partners and allies, let's just talk for a second about how it impacts each of us. In the first instance, we now know that the president's failure to confront the coronavirus effectively had nothing to do with his incompetence, as clear as that is, and nothing to do with his callous disregard for the well-being of the American people. He made a conscious, deliberate decision not to act, not to ring the bell, not to warn the American people when he knew exactly the magnitude of the threat we faced. It would be as if, FDR, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, got on the radio and said, "Never mind, no worries, it's all going to be fine," as you were. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable, even from Donald Trump. And so the American people first need to recognize that we have a commander-in-chief who has absolutely no interest in doing the job of protecting the American people. I don't think we've ever been able to say that in the past. And so when our allies and partners and enemies, in some ways more importantly, around the world look at this and see what he has done, then they have no confidence, I would expect, in our ability and willingness to stand up for our interests, our values, our alliance commitments. And it's a message to our adversaries that they can punk us any which way they choose, because the president of the United States could care less.
And Mayor Pete, I want to turn to you. Obviously, Susan covered a lot of the scope here, but you've talked a lot about the need to make issues accessible to the American people, national security issues, foreign policy issues in general. And I've seen, there's a risk here that people start to make this about whether Bob Woodward should have come forward or not. Sometimes people even glaze over when you use phrases like allies or partners, as I just did. How, is this an issue, the revelations from yesterday, that we should be talking about on the campaign trail, that candidates running? What would your advice be? I think we may be having some audio issues. Sure. I think we're working on some audio issues for Mayor Pete, which hopefully we'll fix shortly. Let me ask you, Susan, because a lot has been said about how President Trump was briefed by his national security advisor, a role you played quite differently in the past. And it looks like on Twitter that during a Fox News interview, Vice President Pence was there for the meeting. Can you tell us just a little bit, what are these meetings like? I mean, what would a briefing be like with a president about an issue like this? Just so people better understand who've never been in one like you have.
Well, I honestly, it's hard for me to know exactly what happens in this White House because everything seems upside down and nothing seems to go according to the norm. But in normal times, on an issue of this magnitude, the president of the United States would be briefed very regularly by his national security advisor, by senior public health officials, people like Dr. Fauci, on the magnitude of the issue and its consequences. And then the president would be not just a participant, but in normal times, the leader of meetings designed to figure out what the United States is going to do to combat the threat. And rather than do any of that, Trump's response, it appears, was completely to determine that it was in his political interest to decide to convey to the American people that this was not a serious threat, to downplay it and not take any of the steps that we all know are necessary in the event of such a pandemic. That's why we had a 69-page playbook on pandemics, which I call Pandemics for Dummies. That's why we had an office that I set up in the NSC to deal with global health security issues. And when the president was first informed, I believe in early January, about the magnitude of this potential virus and what it could do to our health and our economy, that was the point at which he should have begun to order the kinds of preparations that we know we're needing, surging the supply of PPE, procuring ventilators, making sure that we had the hospital bed capacity and the medical personnel ready to deal with a surge, putting in place the testing capacity that is so essential that we still don't have adequately resolved, and making sure that the federal government was leading with its powers of procurement and distribution so that it wasn't a free-for-all with every state competing against the other, every man for himself, jacking up the prices and making sure that we didn't have what we needed where we needed it. So instead of doing any of those things, he lied to the American people about the magnitude of the threat and sat on his behind while we died. It's an extraordinary admission. And then he gets out there and says, I was just trying to make sure nobody panicked and that there wasn't a frenzy, which is the biggest crock, because he's more than happy to panic his base as he sees it when he thinks it's politically expedient, whether, conjuring up images of caravans crossing our borders from the South before the 2018 election to trying to scare what he calls suburban housewives into fearing Cory Booker and his buddies coming into their neighborhoods. I mean, it's just absolutely preposterous. So this is the worst kind of deliberate decision by a president not to do the fundamental aspects of his job and to let us die and people starve and kids not go to school and our economy go into the tank for his political benefit.
Yeah, such an important point about fear. I mean, it was the theme through the Republican convention. It's kind of dominated. So I want to turn back to you, Mayor Pete, and hopefully your audio is fixed. And just kind of ask you about the it's great. So ask you about all of the revelations that came out with the Woodward book, the fact that Trump lied, covered it up, did it purposefully, and how we talk about this. Should we talk about this as an issue looking ahead to the next less than 60 days?
I think we need to talk about this, most of all in terms of the president's failure to keep the Americans safe. But the American people safe, we've always got to come back to the outcome. There are tons of rabbit holes that they'll try to pull us down in debating around this, when the simple fact is that the president failed. And, Ambassador Rice is exactly right. Nothing is more out of character for Donald Trump than the idea that he suddenly does not want to cause fear, panic, or chaos among the American people. It is his specialty to create fear, panic, and chaos among the American people. But they will always try to invent a justification after the fact. So one way to think about it is this. If we assume for a moment that this was actually a strategy, and I doubt that's true, but if it was a strategic choice to withhold important information and mislead the American people, well, then that strategy failed. And that strategy killed an unbelievable number of Americans. Look, if the American people had been told more of the truth, we wouldn't have panicked. We would have responded. And we can see what every other country did whose leaders did tell them the truth. We must not get away from the simple fact that America's response has been the worst in the developed world, and make sure that we're making the case on that. Just one other thing I want to mention: they're always going to try to fit some fact, some justification after the fact to what happened. It reminds me of how they're always trotting out the old discredited madman theory, right? That when the president does something bizarre, embraces a dictator, contradicts himself on the world stage, he's doing it to keep the rest of the world guessing. Not only is that not a strategy, something that doesn't work, but also, even if it were a strategy, It's the strategy most destructive of trust in the United States. And the next president's going to have a lot of work to do in order to reestablish that trust and credibility, which just took yet another blow with these revelations that are somehow shocking and not surprising at the same time.
And I just wanted to kind of follow up a little bit on some of what you've said about how this should be talked about, because there's so many issues out there, and you've talked about this a fair amount on the trail and otherwise, that are related to national security, that are related to policy issues. And Democrats or past administrations haven't really been able to translate that, haven't been able to really touch the American public and elevate them in a way that they understand and get moved behind why it matters how we position ourselves on the world stage. Tell us a little bit more about, what your advice is on that and how you think that should be approached if, and I'll just say when, Vice President Biden becomes president.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very important to make clear that our foreign policy is a foreign policy for places like South Bend. My neighbors are not necessarily going to be moved by the finer points of international organizations and bureaucracies and our relationships with them. But we have a responsibility and an opportunity to talk about how each of these things affects us right here at home. We saw it with the trade wars that were so devastating for farmers and really impacted consumers too. We see it in instability that impacts parts of the country that disproportionately provide the troops who are sent to carry out U.S. foreign policy in so many ways. And we're seeing it now. Not since 9/11 has there been a chain of events that started somewhere else in the world come to affect us here on American soil so profoundly. And so it's a good moment to talk about how we are connected to the rest of the world, not only looking at where we are right now, but also looking to the future, because in many ways, pandemic response is something of a dress rehearsal for climate change, another situation that won't be resolved without international cooperation, depends on paying attention to what scientists have to say, is an area where some will try to get us not to do the right thing out of narrow, short-term economic interests, and something that is going to require American leadership, because while America can't do it alone, it's also clear that the world can't do it without us. We are watching all around us the very same patterns in terms of what it's going to take to deal with the pandemic that are going to really define whether America and ultimately humanity acts and succeeds in time on global security threats like climate. And the more we can bring that home, take it out of the realm of theory, make sure this does not look like an academic concern, but for example, as is happening in the last 24 hours, literally look at pictures of fires in California and Oregon that are devastating, to move these things out of the pages of the journals and into the imagination of Americans figuring out how our lives and our neighborhoods will be different in a year or 10 years, depending on the choices we're about to make.
Yeah. And Ambassador Rice, you have in common lots of things. One is that you've both said climate change is a threat multiplier. So I want to ask you about how you apply what Mayor Pete was saying, and you've talked about climate change as well as an enormous threat. When you're looking at the priorities of a new Biden administration and the national security priorities of a national security team, you've sat in a number of those high-level roles. How do you prioritize it? I mean, how do you work it into all of the work that will need to be done to repair relationships, to address crises, to address things we don't even frankly know about, to rebuild institutions?
Well, climate change has got to be a top priority for a variety of reasons. But the fundamental reason is really the one that Mayor Pete pointed to, which is we live fundamentally in an interconnected world. We cannot escape from the reality that what happens elsewhere matters to the lives of people here in the United States, whether in South Bend or in the District of Columbia. And, the pandemic is the greatest manifestation of that in the moment, where we recognize that whether it's a terrorist cell or a virus or the cracking of the Arctic ice, we are affected fundamentally by what happens elsewhere. And Americans need to understand that, therefore, the reality is we can't put up walls. We can't, pursue an isolationist approach to our security or to our economy and succeed. We're either going to lead and shape the world in which we live, or we're going to be buffeted by it and victimized by it. And so that's the choice we have to make. So when it comes to things like the pandemic or climate change, we'd be far better served by getting out in front, recognizing the challenge, communicating about it simply, clearly, and based on facts and science, and rallying the world to address the problem effectively, as we started to do during the Obama administration with the Paris Climate Agreement and the steps we took at home to get ahead of the problem. So the challenge is both, what do we do here at home to prepare ourselves, whether it's for a pandemic or for climate change, and put in place policies that are sufficiently ambitious to address the challenge, and then bring the world around to confronting it. So climate change is not only urgent and extremely important in its own right, it's a great exemplar of the challenge that we face of leading internationally while we step up our game domestically. And I think the macro theme of the world that Joe Biden, we hope, will inherit is one in which the lines between domestic and foreign are increasingly blurred. We cannot be strong abroad and lead effectively if we don't have our own house in order on everything from immigration to education to the environment, the economy, you name it. And so in many ways, to rebuild our standing internationally, to be strong and effective, to be trusted and respected by our allies, and to be able to tackle challenges like climate change effectively, we're going to have to start by getting our own house in order. And so I think climate change must be an urgent priority for the national security team of the next administration, as well as the economic and domestic policy teams.
And so let me just quickly follow up on that. Do you think, you've sat at a lot of negotiating tables, and what I heard from you and what I've lived too is, if you're at a negotiating table and you say you need to do something on climate, other leaders or their counterparts will say, well, you guys are the biggest emitters and you just rolled back all these policies. So tell us a little bit more about, what do you think needs to happen in order to empower people who are going to be representing the United States on an issue like climate change here, so that they're empowered to be leaders in the world on issues like that?
Well, obviously, I mean, it's got to start by, as Joe Biden's already committed to, getting back in the Paris Climate Agreement on day one. But it's got to go well beyond that. He's laid out a very ambitious set of objectives in terms of, reducing the role of carbon in our economy by 2050 to, de minimis levels. And to get there, particularly in the context of of the timeline of an administration, means that we're going to have to take pretty dramatic steps, not only to get back on the track that we were on when President Trump came into office, in terms of our commitments domestically, but to raise our ambitions far higher, so that we actually can meet the objectives that Vice President Biden has set out in terms of our goals and accomplishments by 2050. And we're going to have to lead the international community. So he's committed to bringing together a summit of the major global players in his first year on climate to help jumpstart this effort. And that's the kind of leadership we're going to have to exhibit, getting our house in order and leading again by example, and rallying the world to do better. Now, the good thing about climate change is the rest of the world gets the problem far better than many of our leaders here in this country do. And one of the ways for us to renew and reinvigorate our leadership is to be ahead of the curve on this issue, a matter that it is so important to the smallest, most landlocked, low-lying countries in the world, islands to the biggest countries. This is an issue where everybody has a stake, and we are the laggard, and our leadership, if renewed, can make a major difference.
And I would know we're going to take some great questions from the audience, but Mayor Pete, I wanted to turn to you. Democrats often highlight the need to recalibrate our foreign policy when it comes to the tools of diplomacy and military strength. And you've talked about this quite a bit yourself. What does that balance look like in practice? And how do you think the next administration should proceed?
Well, more than ever, we're going to need to use the full spectrum of American power in order to vindicate and support our values, provided, as Ambassador Rice said, we're walking the walk here at home. The reality is most of that power is in diplomatic and economic and social terms. The more successful our diplomatic efforts, the more military power is held in reserve. And that's partly the mark of a successful policy. We need to make sure that each of the instruments of American influence is tuned to the others, but it all falls apart if we're not viewed as backing up these things in our own practices. And, not only around climate, but also around democracy. We're in a poor position to do that right now. If American values and American interests are, as I believe, inseparable and intertwined, then we have to make sure we're leading with our values in all of our efforts. And for us to, for example, gather soft power and diplomatic strength by leading peoples of the world who are seeking a greater democracy, we've got to make sure our own leadership is not echoing the vocabulary of dictators, talking about the press as the enemy of the people, or suggesting that any election that is not won by the incumbent is by definition illegitimate, especially when you have a deeply unpopular incumbent. So all of these things are connected. And I think, an enlightened policy going forward, one we have an opportunity to offer, shows a level of regard for our military and the contributions of our service members that this president is clearly incapable of, while recognizing that turning to that military and deploying that military is a last resort that you only turn to when every other instrument that is available to the American president and to the American administration has been exhausted.
I will confirm it is very hard to argue to get press into a press conference overseas if you have approaches to the press like the current president does. So that alone, I will double click on everything you said. We have some questions from the audience, and this one could go to either one or both of you. Does the Trump presidency in any way permanently impair our ability to tell an affirmative story and share an affirmative vision about America, or can we overcome this? I hope you're going to say we can, just to preempt.
Where do you want to start, Jen?
You want to start, Ambassador Rice?
Sure. Thanks. I think we can overcome this with patience and humility if we defeat Donald Trump in November. If we have 4 more years of Donald Trump, I think all bets are off because I don't see how the world can look at a decision by the American people, assuming it's a legitimate decision, and conclude that that we have any interest in playing a responsible leadership role in the world that serves not only our own interests and values, but those of our allies and partners. If we were to, give Donald Trump 4 more years. Now, let's assume that we have Joe Biden in the White House and Kamala Harris, and that we have an opportunity to chart a fresh course. I believe that we can put forward an affirmative view of the United States, but we're going to have to do it with a recognition that a huge amount of damage has been done. And the election of a new president is necessary, but not a sufficient step to undo that damage. There are allies around the world who will rightly wonder, having gone through the last 4 years, what's preventing us from making a similarly misguided choice in 4 years, 8 years, 12 years? And so we're going to have to recognize that it's going to take a constancy of not just messaging, but of actions that are driven by a recognition that what we share with those countries that we need to partner with is not only interests that are shared, but real values that are shared. And we've got to back away from this whole transactional approach to national security and foreign policy, where we penalize our allies with tariffs over steel on national security grounds. And really, the Canadians are our adversary on national security because they produce steel like we do. I mean, it's the kind of thing that is so destructive and corrosive of trust and of our ability to lead. The United States can't lead if others don't want to join with us in whatever the objective is, whether it's defeating ISIS or tackling climate change or dealing with the coronavirus. And so I do think we can, but I also think it goes back to what I said earlier. It's not just how we approach things internationally, it's what we do at home. So we're going to have to get back to leadership that is honest, that has integrity, that respects the rule of law and the freedom of the press and the separation of powers and the legitimacy of oversight. And we're going to have to put in place policies that show a recognition that we have a great deal of work to do at home to repair our many wounds, whether they're with respect to racial injustice and socioeconomic disparities, whether it's with respect to our failure to mount an effective response to the COVID-19, or many of our other institutional failings that have demonstrated to the world that what they expected of the United States may not have been a legitimate expectation. We've got to fix these things that have been so broken here at home to join and reinforce our message and our actions internationally that we are deserving of renewing our leadership role.
And Mayor Pete, how do you approach? Oh, go ahead. I was just going to ask, just to add to it, how do you approach world leaders or counterparts humbly? I mean, with the humility of what the United States just lived through or put upon the world in hopefully a Biden administration.
Well, look, the damage has been colossal, but I don't believe that it has to be permanent. And I think about this mostly in terms of trust. Now, the main way that you develop trust is through repeated, honorable, predictable behavior over very long periods of time. That's going, by definition, to take a while. A very good first step will be to watch the American people reject Donald Trump and elect the Biden-Harris administration. But that's only a beginning, and it will be the project of a generation to establish the kind of credibility that can only come through consistency. Now, having said that, there's another way that trust is built. And I think back to the experience of being a service member, but I think this applies to whole populations and countries too. And that's that you can earn an enormous amount of trust in a short amount of time when you are responding to conditions of tremendous pressure and urgency. And this is where the crises that we face, including climate and certainly the pandemic, represent an opportunity, as terrible of a situation as it is. If we think back right now, there's a lot of acknowledgement of the 75th anniversary of what happened at the end of World War II. In a few short years, America acquired an unbelievably robust level of credibility because America's national project to vindicate and defend democracy was also the most important thing happening in the world. And America put our money where our mouth is. If our national project today is making sure that here at home and around the world, we are responding to climate change and returning to that noble project of defending democracy, but real, actual democracy that is inclusive, that doesn't happen without racial justice and an answer to voter suppression here at home, that doesn't happen without a lot of things changing. If we do that, I think that we can, in accelerated fashion, regain that trust. And again, the pandemic, when we get the vaccine, that's the end of the beginning. There was a news story out today that 8,000 cargo jets will be required just to distribute a vaccine to the places it needs to go around the world. If you actually think about the practicality of it, the everything from refrigeration to security, it's just one example of an enormously important mission that American leadership could play a huge role in. And piece by piece, moment by moment, emergency by emergency, responding in the right way is a way that America can both deserve and acquire the level of trust that was squandered these last 4 years.
And this is another question from the audience. It's a little nerdy, but we're in a safe place. So Ambassador Rice asked to both of you, part of our relationships with the world and country, our allies and adversaries relate to international agreements. I mean, you've talked about the Paris Climate Agreement. At what point do you think we would really prioritize our efforts to restore international agreements? And are there others that people should be watching or focused on early on in a Biden administration?
Well, look, international agreements are not an end in themselves. They're a means to an end. They're a means to ensure that we and others are bound to commitments that make us collectively safer and more secure. And so with that as the backdrop, where they make sense, whether certainly with respect to Paris and hopefully its successor, but also if there's a way that we can find ourselves back to a place where, for example, the Iranian government is prepared to begin to restore its adherence to the JCPOA, then there's a prospect for trying to revive the Iran nuclear deal and hopefully, bolster it with successor understandings. That may or may not be achievable. But whether it's on arms control and non-proliferation, even New START, which ought to be renewed and extended early in 2021 with the Russians. There are a range of agreements, multilateral and bilateral, that have been beneficial to our national security that we ought to be interested in reviving or extending or enhancing. And then we have to look at a range of areas, Jen, where we don't have international agreements in place, but where their utility could be quite substantial. Take the cyber realm, for example. There aren't binding international understandings on cyber. That's a very hard area to come to agreement on. It won't be done without very difficult to achieve understandings between the major powers. And yet having, a jungle environment internationally where anybody can attack anybody's, critical infrastructure with, and start conflicts through cyber means is really not a very stable environment. So we also have to be looking at, a wide range of new realms where we don't have in place instruments historically that are sufficient to the challenge at hand. And again, these are means to an end. They're not ends in themselves. And sometimes, the right mechanisms will be bilateral. Sometimes they'll be multilateral. Sometimes they'll be unilateral. But where we can, in my judgment, we should use international instruments and multilateral vehicles effectively. And one of the more unfortunate aspects of this administration is that they have jettisoned anything that's multilateral by definition. They're not interested in the United Nations. They're not interested in the World Health Organization. They're not interested in any kinds of multilateral trade or security agreements. And that's deeply unfortunate because many of them have been beneficial to our security.
Mayor Pete, any you would add to that? She covered the gamut. But
this is a great moment to think about Joe Biden's mantra of build back better in global terms. I know that's largely about restoring and reimagining the U.S. economy, doing it in pandemic recovery in a way that doesn't just reproduce the same strengths and weaknesses and winners and losers that we had before. I think this would be a good time to think about that in the global context as well. Because where this administration has repealed, it has not replaced, and more to the point, it's usually simply smashed. With that kind of wreckage does come an opportunity. There are so many things that exist in our international framework that, frankly, we're due for some kind of update or revision. Of course, it was a mistake to demolish them the way that this administration has. But, having spoken warmly of the status that the U.S. enjoyed in the World War II and immediate post-war era, it's also the case that a lot of our frameworks date back to then and are ready to be refreshed. So we have a moment now provided, again, that we are authentically and credibly leading, to help guide, whether it's bilateral or multilateral frameworks, into a 21st century pattern that recognizes the ways that the world has changed, that accommodate the reality of what's happened around us in terms of technology, and that are going to be stable and robust for the future. I think anytime we see that this administration has burned something down, we should apply some imagination to what we're going to build in its place. Even domestically, on a different note, but I think it's parallel, within our civil service. And this is certainly true for the personnel who represent our national security and diplomatic and intelligence future. Now's a chance to create new flexible career paths at a moment when we're going to have to recruit and invite a generation of diverse, forward-facing Americans to represent us, stepping into often spaces left by so many demoralized American public servants who have left or been driven out under the current administration.
Well, hopefully many of those people are listening now. And Ambassador Rice is nodding. Mayor Pete, everybody's inviting you if you're listening. Come join the federal government. But Ambassador Rice, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to foot stomp what Mayor Pete just said about coming up with creative career paths and new tools to attract and retain top talent in our national security agencies. A lot of them have, very methodical, long, calcified career paths where you have to, come in your effectively in your 20s and wait until you're in your 50s to reach the highest realm of leadership. The State Department is a classic example. The Foreign Service tracked to become an ambassador is, over 20 years long. And in a modern economy where nobody that I know of under the age of 40 stays in a job much longer than 5 years, that's a really hard, path to hoe. And I think we're missing our ability to attract and retain some of the best talent by having, this traditional career path that has certain benefits, no doubt. I mean, it builds expertise. It inculcates, certain expectations and values that are useful, but it is increasingly obsolete. And so we need to be willing, in my judgment, to reimagine things like that. And that involves not just what a new administration can do, but it involves also trying to achieve the buy-in of the workforce and the unions that may have a different view as to how this should operate.
Well, there's no better note to end on, given the audience. And I want to thank both of you, Ambassador Rice and Mayor Pete Buttigieg, for reminding people how interconnected the domestic and global agenda is, giving us a little shining beacon of light in these dark moments. I have the honor of also passing the torch over to Heather Hurlburt, who will be closing this morning with quite a panel with Jake Sullivan and Senator Elizabeth Warren, and they'll be talking about corruption and inequality at home and abroad. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Mayor Pete. Nice to see you.
Great.
Take care.